Next spring semester, I am going to be on sabbatical. And the topic of my sabbatical was going to be the gig economy, labor in the gig economy. Obviously, things have changed a little bit since I applied for my sabbatical. And so it's still going to be gig economy stuff, but in the age of COVID. How has this, for example, affected what you might want to do when you graduate? Your job prospects when you graduate? I would really like to talk with you about this. Obviously, it's a little difficult talking to my iPad. But next semester, hopefully, it's looking good. I don't want to say anything, but it's looking good for some face-to-face stuff. I'd really like to get your input. So in each one of these sections, obviously we talked about labor, slavery, and the Civil War time period, but in each one of the sections that we have remaining, I devote a discussion on labor, changes in labor, and the economics behind labor. So from the Civil War, approximately to World War I, what does labor look like? So here's the descriptive stuff I want to go over. This is, textbooky, descriptive, and then we'll get to the economics of it, but, as a context. So the population of the United States in this 40-year time period, 1870 to 1910, 40 million to 92.4 million. But look at the labor force. So doubling in population, a little over doubling the population, but almost tripling the labor force. How is that possible? Here's the answer. Right? So in this same time period, immigration, there were 23 million immigrants to the United States. And we talk about old immigrants and new immigrants in this time period. 1870s, the old immigrants, we're talking about England, Ireland, Germany, Scandinavia, Norway, and Sweden. And then in the 1910s, we talk about the new immigrants. So old immigrants, Northwest Europe, Southeast Europe, Italy, Greece, Hungary, Serbia, those countries. So that kind of explains some of the changes in the labor force. Life expectancy in this time period went from 44 to 52. Women in the labor force, not a real dramatic change, and this is the labor force percentage. So the number of women in the labor force in this 40-year time period increased from 2.5 million to 8.5 million. But as a percent of the labor force, only 15% to 20%. Nothing like, for example, the 40 years we see after World War II. This is kind of interesting. Child labor, the number of children, and we're talking about ages 10 to 15. In 1880, there were 1 million children in the labor force. That doubles as far as the number in 30 years. By 1910, percent of labor force stayed the same, about 5%. And this is kind of interesting. There was a decrease in 1 million children in the labor force from 1910 to 1920. In 1916, Congress passed a law making child labor illegal, with some exceptions like farm kids. But the Supreme Court struck it down as unconstitutional in 1916. But states individually started to make child labor within the state illegal. Child labor doesn't become illegal until the 1930s. I don't remember exactly what year. And then the topic for the rest of this lecture is we're going to look at unionization, the economics behind unions. If we look at union membership in this time period, this is kind of interesting. From 1880 to 1886, look at the dramatic increase in the number of unionized workers, right? From 50,000 to 1 million in 6 years. John Green talked about this, you remember, in one of the history videos. It's the Knights of Labor, the first major national union. And as far as the labor force percentage rate, 0.3% to 5%. Okay, that's not huge, but pretty dramatic increase in those 6 years. What happened in 1886? Get to that in a minute. We see a decline from 1 million to 325,000, so labor force participation rate goes down, and then by 1910 we get back to over 5%, 6%. At the eve of World War I, we had closer to 9%. Okay, so what I want to talk about in this time period is an interesting relationship between the industrialization of America as we shift from agriculture to manufacturing, and the relationship between workers and management, and the organization of workers, unions, and the relationship unions had with management. All right, so this change here in 1886, so the Knights of Labor, the predominant national union in 1880. In 1886, there was a strike in Chicago. It became a riot called the Haymarket Riot. Workers had organized and gone on strike, and they were striking for the 8-hour workday, as well as other things. They essentially lost that strike. The workers got fired, and unionization fell apart. And they didn't have any central organization, no strong leadership. But out of this came a small group of unionized workers, which eventually became the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, who was the leader, his name was Samuel Gompers. And the AFL, which was organized more around crafts, around specific skills, started to gain membership, and as you probably know, the AFL is a large union group today. But it started in 1890, and by 1910, the majority of unionized workers were members of the AFL. Okay, so I want to spend the rest of this lecture on the economics of unions, and we're going to see how this has changed in our various time periods. So what did organized labor look like in this time period? So there are two general categories of unions. Unions can be based on an industry, like the American Auto Workers. Of course, that didn't apply to this time period, but the American Railroad Union did apply in this time period. So those were unionized workers that could be in different firms, but in the same union. So United Auto Workers, you could have United Auto Workers and Ford and General Motors in the same union. So the union was organized around industries. So one category of organized workers is industrial. The other category is craft. So your local meat cutters, your local plumbers union. So these unions are organized around specific skills or crafts. And the majority of AFL workers were workers organized around specific skills. And another thing we're going to see in these different time periods is the type of unions. So there are 4 types of unions. So when workers organize and say, okay, we have formed a union, it's not quite that easy, and management goes, okay, well, the agreement that workers and management come to, once management, employers recognize that the workers are unionized, they have negotiations, sign a contract, and that contract is called the collective bargaining agreement. And the collective bargaining agreement consists of lots of things, but one of the things is, what type of union are you? What type of union are we dealing with? So types of unions include the closed shop. So if a union is a closed shop, that means that in order for the firm, again, this is part of the collective bargaining agreement, to hire someone, that person has to be a member of the union before they can even be hired. So they got to join the union, then the firm can employ them. That's called a closed shop. Second type of union is the union shop. And the union shop is you can employ or you can hire non-union workers, but eventually they need to join, they have to join the union. The third is the open shop. And the open shop is, there is a union, but you don't have to join the union. And so management can hire anyone they want. Once they're employed, they can decide whether or not they want to be a part of the union. That's an open shop. One of the concerns with an open shop is what's your incentive to join the union? And so the union is fighting for higher wages, for benefits, for grievance procedures, job security, all this stuff. But you don't want to pay your dues, so you're still going to benefit from what the union does, but you don't want to pay your dues. So that created a fourth type of union called an agency shop. And which isn't relevant to this time period. It was something that was added later on. But the agency shop is you don't have to join the union, but you still have to pay union dues. And there are some situations where you may not have to pay, you have to pay the dues, but the dues don't necessarily have to go to the union. They can go to charity, for example. This was later on. For the time period we're looking at, these were the types of unions. And what we're going to see in the next time period is what legally happened to the union statuses, both in 1935 during the Depression and then post-World War II, the Taft-Hartley Act. But for now, these are the types of unions. So union goals, we think of the primary one. So if we're looking at what are the goals of unions, right? And wages, obviously, number one typically are wages, but working conditions. And so all of this stuff is laid out in the collective bargaining agreement. Got wages, working conditions, benefits, job security, grievance procedures. Okay, these are examples of goals that unions set out to do, and this is all laid out in the collective bargaining agreement. Well, oftentimes there is no agreement. That unions and management don't get along. They can't agree on things. We hear about this all the time. Right? So what are the tools available to organized workers, unions, or businesses that they can use to fight to get what they want? So we call these union tactics and business tactics. So union tactics. So the obvious one that we all know about is the strike, right? We're not going to show up to work. Another tactic that unions employ would be the slowdown. You've got sympathy strikes or secondary boycotts. Secondary boycotts are, they're not going to handle products if another union's on strike and they hire other workers and they're producing an intermediate product. Workers in this union won't deal with those products because those workers are not unionized. That's a secondary boycott. And then business tactics. So the opposite of a strike on the business side is called a lockout, where you don't let the workers come to work. They can lock the workers out. Another tactic businesses employed is called a yellow dog contract. And the yellow dog contract is that you're going to employ someone. Let's say it's a union shop, or let's say it's an open shop. You employ someone, but they say, oh, you can work for us, but you need to sign this contract that states you're not going to join the union. So we're not going to employ any unionized workers. So if you want to work for us, you got to sign this contract. It's called a yellow dog contract. Blacklisting was another tactic used by businesses. You get your name on a list. This is a union agitator or organizer. Don't hire this person. And the most common is a court order making union activity illegal, and that's called an injunction. This will also be interesting. The time period now that we're talking about, Civil War, World War I, this stuff's pretty much all legal. Nothing illegal about any of this. But as we move into the 20th century, some of these are going to become illegal. All right, you ready for the economics? Okay, let's do the economics. 2 areas of economics now. All this descriptive stuff, where's the economics behind it? All right, first, the economics behind unions' attempt to increase wages. So we call these union models. And there are 3 models. These are ways that unions attempt to increase their wages. The first union model is called the derived demand model. The derived demand model looks at how can unions attempt to increase wages if we look at a market, a labor market, that the firm is looking at, and the price of the workers, which is called the wage rate, and the quantity of workers, or the quantity of labor. And so let's put up a labor market, right? So you got supply of labor, demand for labor, right? So this is the labor market. This will be the wage rate, and this will be the number of workers, QL, employed. So what unions do, many unions, is to try to increase wages by increasing the demand for workers producing this product. But remember, it's called a derived demand because the demand for labor is based on the demand for what the workers are producing. So you want to increase the demand for auto workers, you got to increase the demand for autos. Right, so increasing the demand for the product that the workers are producing will increase the demand for the workers. And you increase the demand for the workers, shift right. What happens? Yeah, we're going to hire more workers. Good. But we're also going to pay them more. Good. Real simple model, right? Just shifting demand to the right. So that's a derived demand model. One way that unions attempt to increase wages is to increase the demand for the product that they're producing. Look for the union label. This model is associated with industrial unions, right? Unions organized around industries. A craft type of union model, the second union model we're going to talk about, is called the membership restriction model. So number 2, membership restriction. And the membership restriction model is if we have a labor market. Sometimes I wonder, did I turn it on? Did I forget to turn it? I've done that before. Sorry. The membership restriction model. Again, let's start with a model. Labor market, supply, demand, here's the wage rate, the number of workers. But instead of looking at increasing demand for our product, sometimes unions can increase wages by restricting the number of workers they allow into the union. Right, membership restriction. We only allow a certain number of meat cutters or plumbers into the union. So we restrict the supply. And by restricting the supply, yeah, there's not going to be as many members of the union, but the wages go up. This is membership restriction. All right. The last model, and what we're going to talk about for the remainder of this lecture, is called the collective bargaining model. Collective bargaining model is going to take me a while to explain, but let's do it. This is the important one. Number 3, collective bargaining. On Canvas, I posted a more detailed marginal productivity theory. It's under labor market cases. If you don't have that available to you right now, go get it. Pause the recording, go get this, print it off. I want you to have access to it as I discuss it. All right, so in order to understand collective bargaining, we got to go back to marginal productivity theory. So on the last section, we talked about marginal productivity theory with regard to slavery, the decision to buy slaves. The slave trade will end when? Using marginal productivity theory. It's a little more detailed now. I mean, you have that backdrop, right? We're looking at the additional revenue generated versus the additional cost, but more detail to that. So when a firm makes a decision, and again, it's still the decision we're looking at, marginal revenue product versus marginal resource cost, just like with slavery. But the marginal revenue product, as I mentioned with slavery, is based on the price of the product, right? Price of cotton. Well, we just held the price of cotton at 10 cents or whatever a bushel. We didn't change that. But in reality, the marginal revenue product, which is a reflection of how much revenue you get selling your product and how workers contribute that. But sometimes firms have market power in selling the output, and sometimes firms have no market power. So there are actually two situations in selling their output. Is the firm selling their product in a competitive market, like agriculture, where you just sell it, you have no influence on the price? Or is the firm selling their product where they have some market power? Monopoly, for example. So are they selling a product in the competitive market? Think of the last couple lectures. Or are they selling it as a monopolist? That will influence the price of the product and therefore how much revenue workers are contributing. The second thing we have to consider is that a firm is employing workers. Is the firm employing workers from a competitive labor market where there's no market power that the workers have? Or are they employing workers where the firm has the ability to set wages? So if a firm can employ workers at a wage rate and they can get as many workers as they want to at that wage rate, that's a competitive labor market. But if the firm has to pay higher wages to get more workers to show up, then they have power. They're determining the wages. And we call that monopsony power. So the cases, and so what this handout illustrates, and I know most of you have seen this, but what this handout illustrates are those 4 possible cases where a firm is selling its output in a competitive market or imperfect competition, like monopoly. And is the firm employing workers from a competitive labor market or monopsony, imperfect competitive labor market? So you have the 4 possible cases now. So what this handout illustrates are the different situations that the firm can face, and then defining all of those variables, which you already know from the previous exam. So case number 1, perfect competition in the product market, selling their output, perfect competition in employing workers in the labor market. Case 2, imperfect competition in selling the product, monopoly power, but perfect competition employing inputs. Case number 3, perfect competition in selling the output, but the firm has monopsony power in employing workers. In case number 4, monopoly power in selling the output and monopsony power in employing workers. We call case 4 the bilateral monopoly. They've got market power on both sides. All right, once you know how to fill in these numbers, right, and here are the definitions for all those variables, the golden rule is the same as it was when we talked about slavery. And the golden rule, as you know, is MRP equal MRC. And if it doesn't, then MRP greater than MRC, you hire that worker. If the MRP is less than the MRC, you do not hire that worker. So it's just like the golden rule in the product market that we talked about yesterday, but now we're looking at the golden rule in employing inputs, also related to the previous section with slavery. So go through, figure out for each one of these cases, right, how many workers are you going to employ. As long as that worker is contributing more revenue than cost, you're going to employ those workers. How many workers are going to be employed in each one of these cases? All right, that's marginal productivity theory based on the 4 possible situations that a firm faces. All right, now I'm going to draw the graphs associated with each one of these cases. Case number 1, and again, it's going to be consistent. I'm going to use different numbers, but the graphs would look similar to the ones on that handout. Case 1. It's a labor market. Again, so think of it as a labor market, but it's the firm's labor market. Wage rate, quantity of labor. So the demand that the firm has for workers, in case 1, the demand for workers, downward sloping function, but they have no market power in selling their output, so the demand for their workers is the same as the MRP for the workers. Perfect competition in employing workers means that the supply of labor, and whenever I put a supply of labor function on, because you don't see the SL in that, the supply of labor is simply the W. It's the wage rate. How much do I have to pay workers for them to show up? And if it's perfect competition, by the way, this was the case we used with slavery, real simple example, is the additional cost, marginal resource cost of labor. So here's the graph for case 1. How many workers are they going to employ? Golden rule, MRP, MRC, where are they equal? Here. That's how many workers the firm is going to employ. And then go up to the wage line. Here's the wage line. And that's how much they're going to pay. Boom, that's case 1. The graph for case 1. Case 2. Case 2 is the firm now has market power in selling their output. So again, what does case 2 look like for the firm? Wage rate, number of workers, the demand for workers, but they have monopoly power so they can set prices. So just like marginal revenue falls below the demand, when you have monopoly power, the marginal revenue product falls below the demand. Now they're still employing workers, case 2, in a competitive labor market. Go ahead, stop, take a break. If I'm losing you, take a break, come back. I'm going kind of fast, I understand. It's important stuff though. Okay, welcome back. Supply of labor equals MRC. So what does the firm do? Golden rule, MRP, MRC, they're going to employ that number of workers, where MRP equals MRC. That's the number of workers they're going to employ. Go up to the supply. If the supply tells us the wage, boom, case 2. All right, case 3. Case 3, by the way, is the collective bargaining model. It's the one we're going to use for understanding collective bargaining. Or we'll just call it case 3. Case 3, we're taking the product market out. I mean, we're holding it constant. So competitive, demand equals MRP. All right, this is case 3, perfect competition in selling the product. But now they have monopsony power. So the wage is below how much each worker is contributing to total cost of labor. So this is what case 3 looks like. How many workers is the firm going to employ? MRP, MRC equals here. All right, here's the key to this. This is how many workers I'm going to employ, but how much do I have to pay to get that number of workers? Where's the wage line? Boom, it's right here. This is how much you pay. Case 3. Case 4, the bilateral monopoly. Bilateral monopoly is the firm has market power in selling their output, monopoly, and they have market power in employing inputs, monopsony. So, case 4. I don't know why I'm using Roman numerals, but I did. Okay. Wage, quantity of labor, imperfect competition in the product, imperfect competition in the labor market, supply of labor, wage, MRC. So they're going to employ MRC equals MRP, boom, right here. And how much they have to pay to get that number of workers? Wow, just down here. That's how many workers they would employ. All right, those are the graphs that correspond to the 4 possible cases. All right, the last thing, back to the collective bargaining model. There's another handout on Canvas. Make sure you have that available, and I'm going to go over that now. The collective bargaining model illustrates why firms want to employ workers where they have monopsony power. Firms want to be able to set wages. Just like firms want to be able to set prices, firms want to be able to set wages. So this handout is called Collective Bargaining Model. It's actually called Perfect Competition versus Monopsony, and this is a problem that you'll see on the exam. Given the following graph, compare competitive labor market with monopsony. So let's do the math here. I'm going to introduce a couple of new concepts, but I'm just going to do what you have on Canvas. Okay. Perfect competition versus monopsony. Why workers like firms to compete for their labor. Why firms want monopsony power and therefore don't like unions. All right, so here's the graph. Given the following graph, move it over here. So all of this is on that handout. We got wage rate and quantity of labor. All right, we're going to compare just like we did yesterday with perfect competition versus monopoly on one graph. We're doing the same thing, and it's a welfare analysis with perfect competition versus monopsony on one graph. This is also case 3. It is the collective bargaining model. Okay, so Demand for labor equals MRP, right? Part of case 3. Supply of labor, which is the wage line, the MRC. Okay, we're now going to put some numbers here. Demand choke price would be, or wage choke price would be 24. This would be 12. 60, 40, 8, 16, origin. All right, there's the numbers, just like here. Now let's compare perfect competition, monopsony. What are we going to compare? We're going to compare the number of workers that would be employed, quantity of workers. So this is the supply of labor in a competitive labor market is the same as the MRC, right? So this is perfect competition. This marginal resource cost is imperfect competition, or monopsony. Same thing. Imperfect competition in the labor market is monopsony. So MRC and perfect competition, MRP, they are equal right here, 60 workers. What is the wage going to be in the competitive? So that's the competitive labor market. 60 workers go up to the wage line, boom, $12 an hour. All right, so here are some new concepts. It's very similar to consumer surplus and producer surplus, but we call it worker surplus. I'll write that out. It's on here, worker surplus. The worker surplus is you getting paid more than you would have accepted. Just like consumer surplus, good for the consumers when you pay less than you would have paid. Worker surplus is I'm getting paid more than I would have worked for. Right? That's a good thing for me. So the workers are getting paid $12 an hour. The supply of labor tells us how much they would have worked for. Different number of workers would have worked for less. So the worker surplus is below the wage rate, above the supply of labor. So it's this right triangle. Follow my finger. All right, so we got 12 times 60 times 1/2 is 360. Okay. Employer surplus is the employers paying less than they would have paid to get that number of workers to show up. Right? So the employer surplus is above the wage rate, below the demand for workers. So it's this right triangle, which is 12 times 60 times 1/2, also 360. Total surplus, 720. Again, in any competitive situation, we don't have deadweight loss. All right, if it's monopsony, so imperfect competition or monopsony, MRC, MRP equals here, go down. The monopsonist is only going to employ 40 workers. Okay, don't mess this part up, right? So they're only going to have to pay the 40 workers. Stop when you hit the wage line, $8 an hour. Now the worker surplus, below wage, above supply. This is the worker surplus, is only 8 times 40 times 1/2, which is 160. But the employer surplus, below demand, above the wage rate, is this, which consists of employer surplus, employer surplus. Here we got 8 times 40 times 1/2, which is 160. And here we've got 8 times 40, 320, 480. Total amount of surplus, 640. Deadweight loss, 80, which is this. But let's look. You can see why the firm wants wage setting ability, monopsony, because the employer surplus is greater when they have monopsony power. And of course, workers, their surplus goes down. when the firm has monopsony power. So what the collective bargaining model is this range right here, this range between what the workers are paid. So there's 40 workers, the firm's going to pay them $8 an hour. This range tells us that those 40 workers are contributing $8 an hour. And if you're contributing more than you're getting paid, that's exploitation. So the workers are paid less than what they're adding to the firm. So this range, the difference between the value of what they're contributing to the firm and how much they're getting paid, is a monopsonistic exploitation. Or in the collective bargaining model, it's that workers can bargain and say, hey, we're contributing more revenue than you're paying us. Pay us more or we go on strike. Or we're more valuable to you than this. And you don't have to reduce the number of workers, you just have to reduce the amount of monopsonistic exploitation. That's why we call this the range of collective bargaining. Unions get together and say, pay us more, you can afford to pay us more, we're contributing more revenue to the firm than you're paying us. And that 20-minute discussion was on collective bargaining. Okay, I know I went through a lot there, but it's important to understand the economics behind organized labor and why firms really didn't like them, and yet workers really needed to organize in this time period. And we're going to see through the next couple time periods how the relationship between organized labor and management has changed. And this is probably one of the most violent time periods as far as unions and management in the history of the United States. Okay, I will see you tomorrow.